So I wanted to discuss a fairly exciting or at least interesting topic, which is this idea of immortality. And there's a postmodernist scientific or science first perspective on this, spearheaded by someone named Brian Johnson, who is an American tech millionaire, spending inordinate amounts of money every year on procedures, very groundbreaking, but you might call them radical procedures in terms of him and his kin trying to prolong and potentially stave off death, in which he was, as I said, being very experimental. And if you don't know who he is, you obviously can take the time to find out via his internet profile. I think he has a YouTube channel, etc., where he goes through all the various procedures that he's undertaking and its efficacy and the nature of the treatments, and flying all across the world to undergo what are not called sanctioned or regulated treatments. But in that, I think, and underlying that for sure, is this idea of immortality and how we all view ourselves as temporal vessels for a spirit, and that there is a longing for the infinite exposure to the celestial underpinnings of reality, which is to say, you want to be experiencing and conscious. Now, we won't delve into too much discussion here on consciousness and what that actually means, but in a very basic premise, we can just understand it as our soul's interaction, and this is vividly and with some element of nous, that you have a waking and being body and mind capable of understanding its current station and its current place in the world. And from that, I think, is the important distinction that this is not a new phenomenon. Obviously, almost all human strivings and events and occurrences throughout history have been born out of a fear of death and underlying either implicit fear or the, you could say, revenant and spectre that looms upon us, and the pall that it casts. The idea that death is the impetus for action and to procreate, but then from procreation to do much more, either resource gathering, empire building, power obtaining, treasure seeking, that sort of element. And then obviously in the Faustian sense, this takes a different pathway. You can think of the Egyptians and the reverence for death, and that the idea that it's just a prolongation of your life into a distinct and similar realm. And then also obviously with Norse mythology and the paganism around Ragnarok, and how there's a cycle, that there's a reborn, but also death doesn't necessarily mean this finite, or finite, I should say, and solemn occasion for expiration and you're never heard from again, but rather if you're worthy and chosen by Odin or his opposite, his shadow Hel, in that you'll be chosen to represent humanity, in Ragnarok against the enemies of the gods. And so we can play with this idea that our underlying desire to be immortal or to live forever, this invulnerability of body as it is chosen to represent our soul, and thus being a large contributor to that being and meaning. Now, in the Havamal, it goes on to say, which is potentially a book written with words of wisdom from Odin's perspective on that, cattle die and kinsmen die, and so one dies oneself. One thing now that never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. Because the idea of immortality can possess an iota of our own spirit, of our own existence, and that we can feel comfortable with death so long as we feel as if we will be remembered, and that previous generations have held us in esteem, and that and going forward for posterity's sake we can be remembered to some degree. But with science, we've obviously been able to stave off the more obvious maladies that have previously been the cause of many deaths, and that now it's, at least of this scientific community's opinion, that death is a problem which can be solved, which that it is an organic problem rather than necessarily a philosophical or cosmic reality. and that the entropy can be cheated to a degree. And we can see that obviously desire, and the closer we get to something like this, the more fevered and zealous become the people pursuing it. So Brian Johnson, obviously, with his cult almost following of Don't Die, and the amount of energy and effort that's expended in the pursuit of not dying versus living life as it was and achieving greatness. But there's a parallel to this in that if you were to defeat death to some degree, then that is achieving greatness. So I think we can almost align ourselves, or very much we can have some sympathy for Brian's cause, because it is quite a Faustian perspective when it comes to death is just one more problem to defeat. And this has been mythologized, and we can talk somewhat to the archetype here of something like a vampire, where we understand the parasitical element that we must leech life from others or from something else to maintain our own, and that it becomes a degrading procedure, that we become less of who we were for what we sacrifice in terms of our own ego's prolongation. And you can see in the pictures of Brian Johnson, I think it's a natural element to his visage that he tends towards this ability to be perceived vampirically, parasitically almost. It is very much akin to Nicholas Flamel and his idea of the Philosopher's Stone, in which he was able to construct this magical, or now maybe we view it as scientific, drug versus a stone, an actual elemental and celestial icon or talisman, which would then prolong your life in a way that would allow your body to not degrade past a certain point. And obviously there was a lot of mythos around his 200, 300 years aging. There's also been very many cases of the backwoods, third world, old wise man claiming himself to be 200, 300 years old. And you can see this across different societies in the third world, like China and India, Africa and Central Asia, etc. But we understand death, and we understand the process of living and dying in a much different way in the West, in that it becomes such a charged topic that we were the first modern society to introduce something like euthanasia. And obviously the idea that you can be killed by society, in that we can have a procedure for killing people that's not a punishment, but it's actually seen as a virtue. It's seen as this embodiment of ethical and upstanding morality, which once again is a contest around potentially a casuistry, but around the philosophical difference between living by choice and dying by choice. But I think keeping it more centralized on the thesis here, which is to say that the idea of immortality should be, at least in its soulful way, ironically enough, the pursuit of an infinity. And the infinity is that pull towards being. And if it is being alive forever, that is the pursuit, then it's done in the mechanism that we have. And that for us is our Western science. And that we will pursue the ways in radical forms until we can either solve what is either a solvable problem, in that death is just a biological phenomena, or that we have to understand that there is a finitude to life and living in this, at least our realm and our plane of reality. And that it has to be your fervent belief that your pursuit of the things you do in life relates to how you think death will overcome you. If it is this black infinite nothingness where you come from and then return to, then you want to make as much out of the brief, very shockingly short period of what you would call life out of that infinity. And that's what Oswald Spengler talks very much into, which is to say it's the spurring of any action is from this. It's almost like a gasp, this humanity's struggle against what is the definitive grip of entropy. That to me is the charming and the interesting element here. So watching Brian Johnson, and we can follow his, I guess you'd call it, journey, and whether it's a hero's journey or a villain's journey is remain to be seen. But I think in the admiration of someone who's willing to sacrifice things for an outcome, then it is probably a more heroic journey for him, that he's willing to sacrifice himself, and in this case to himself, to reach this goal. And this is that final frontier of biology as a science. And if there are chemical compounds and procedures that we can invent just to solve these problems, then there's nothing we really can't solve. If we can stave off death, we can stave off the death of the universe. There's nothing that can't be done by our race. And so that's why I think it's such an important and integral journey to follow, and that we should be supportive, even if it's the case that he turns out to be this vampire that corrupts us. Then at least it's the Faustian destiny that was always going to be our downfall, was ourselves.